Part 2 of procedural. Does that mean it's twice as hard as part 1 or only plus 1 harder than part 1? Does it mean that this intro is going to be twice as long? Yeah, either way, welcome back everybody back to the darkness where we are going to continue working on our completely procedural cone. So where did we leave off on part 1? Well, we kind of made this, let me get rid of the displacement, we made this kind of rounded, not kind of, we did make this rounded rectangle, which we can control many aspects of procedurally, like the rounding, how round this is, so we could have like sharp corners or something else. We have the side length, which is just one parameter instead of two because it's a square, not a rectangle. So one side length describes both of them because they're the same. And then I guess if we put our displacement back and view this BSDF, which actually gives us nice displacement, we also made a parameter for the height of this, which is really just what we're multiplying. And I know it's playing very slowly, or it's actually rendering very slowly. And you know, that's par for the course with displacement. But what was I saying? I was saying that this base height is basically what we're multiplying by before it reaches displacement. So it's just kind of like a scaling before it reaches here. Okay, so what do I want to talk about today? We've already covered quite a bit. Well, I think that the next step should be we've made the base of the cone. Let's make the actual part of the cone, which is actually just the rest of the geometry, right? Once you have the base and the cone, everything else is just coloring, like the stripes and the orange and the dirt. So yeah, that's the game plan. I guess let's just do it. And you might think, oh, do we need to make another giant node group like this and then just package it up? Not really. If you think about it, what do we need to do? We need to make a cone, which is kind of like a circular thing that goes upwards. And as we've already made circles before for these corners, we kind of already know how to approach this. So I guess let's just do that. So I'm going to start off with the same object coordinates as before. And by the way, while we're making this, it might be helpful to disable displacement just for now, just so we can see what we're doing very nicely. Okay. So what do we have? We have our object coordinates, and we want to make a circle. I already showed you the trick for this, and that is using a vector math node and setting it to length, which again works because, let me view this. It works because what it does is it takes the input vector and outputs the length, the magnitude, the size of that vector, where the origin being the center, this black area right here, that is the vector 0, 0, 0, which means it has a magnitude, a length, a size of 0. And as you go radially outward from the origin, it gives us this spherical. Technically, it's spherical, not a circular or radial, because it does work in 3 dimensions, but whatever. It gives us a nice spherical gradient, which is exactly what we need to make a circle. So right now, let's say that we took this and incorporated it into our displacement. What would happen? Well, let me just set this up and view this. Well, how would we incorporate it in the first place? Well, we know that we need to do this incorporation, keep saying that over and over and over again, we need to do that before it reaches this height, because once we get to this displacement node, everything's final. So what we can do is we can add in a math node set to add, since we want to take this, and not in the sense of intersection, but or. Again, add is or, multiplies and. So we're just going to add this, and you can see that it kind of incorporates both of them. We still have our base, kind of, but it's using this radial kind of gradient to make something super strange. So it is incorporating both of them, just not necessarily in the way we want. And that's because this isn't really like a circle in the area that we want. We want to, first of all, invert it, because you saw that the displacement was highest at the boundaries. Let me just show you again. Highest at the boundaries and lowest in the center. Okay, so there's a couple ways to fix this. You could either try like an inversion, which is just kind of like the naive approach, I like to call it. So we connect that to color. So this is what inverted looks like. So I keep having to get rid of a displacement, but you can see this is inverted and this is not inverted. So it does give us the highest value, the biggest height in the center, which is what we want. But I'm actually going to use something a bit more sophisticated. Get ready for a new node, everybody. RGB curves. Oh, yes. When we just add this normally, it's not really going to do anything. So this is without and this is with. It doesn't do anything. However, let's just connect this here and view what this gives us with our BSDF. So you can see this gives us the same thing, but however, let me finish that sentence now. We can do the inversion using this RGB curves instead of the invert node, which you might be thinking, that kind of seems harder, and it is, but there's a reason for it. So to invert, we say when x, or really not x, when this input is equal to 0, it has a height of 0. So we can actually just map it to 1, which is the inverse. And then when it's 1, we map it to 0. So we kind of just flipped it. So you can see how we kind of now have the opposite kind of thing going on. And something that you might notice is some of the displacement is actually negative, like it goes below the floor plane. And that indicates, and that's fine, right? But that indicates that this output, what's being outputted from here, is not clamped, right? There are values smaller than 0, which in this case is not what we want because we don't want anything going under our base. That was a gnarly voice crack. So how do we get clamping going on? The trick I like to use is I like to use a math node set to add with 0, so that we just take this. And then basically what's happening here is RGB curves is being added 0. In other words, nothing's happening. But if we enable clamp, then this just kind of works like a clamp node. So without and with. Just make sure that there's no negative displacement. Okay, that's useful. However, you can still see that, this circle is kind of going wider than our base. And that's why we're getting this weird shape. So if we could somehow scale what's going on, then that would work. Of course, there's a couple ways to do this. We could either manipulate what's being sent into here. So we could, let's get rid of the clamping. We could just multiply. And then this basically manipulates the radius of our circle. So you can see now it barely, but at least kind of looks like a cone. I wouldn't recommend this because the reason why I added this RGB curves is because we can do everything we need and more inside this node. So to fix this, what we're going to do is, I think it's this one, if we think about it. We want the area where the radius is 0 to happen way before it goes out here, right? So we kind of want to scrunch it in, so therefore we just, if I can click it, we just drag this inwards. So you can see what this is doing. It's just making our cone a bit smaller in the same sense that our math trick before was. So now you can just slide this to where you want. Now I think a cone is something like this. We'll see. Something like that. And, of course, the next issue is that a cone doesn't have a pointy tip. But what if I told you that we could literally just draw what this looks like? So here's a fat boy egg cone. You can also cut inwards and make a bunch of weird designs. This is the idea. And basically what we're doing here, as I've already made a video about this, we're kind of graphing using our radius as an input, our length as an input. So as it goes outwards, we're going along this RGB curve. So when radius is 0, meaning it's at the center of the base, it starts up here with the highest height, so that's why it has that tip. And as we go radially outward, it's going to go diagonally down to 0, so that's why it cuts off. And you can see how it's kind of obvious if you kind of look at the profile. So you see this curve is the same as this curve. Okay, so all of that being said, how do we flatten the top? Well, I'm just going to add a node right here, and then also set this to vector handle, which is going to give us a nice sharp, no smoothing kind of thing. And we're going to set this all the way to 1. So basically, any values between here and here are just going to be maximum. And then we just need to drag this in. So it doesn't happen that late, but just pretty early. And you can see how this kind of gives us something somewhat cone-like, right? It has a flat top. So why does this look horrible still? I think it's because it's not tall enough. And we could either, fix this by manipulating the base with our parameters, but assuming we want to keep this the same, let's instead manipulate the cone. So remember, everything we did over here, we multiplied, we scaled before it even reached our displacement. We can do the same thing over here. So let's just multiply. No need to clamp since we've already clamped before. So we're going to multiply. And then if this is set to 1, we're getting the same thing as before because we just pipe everything in and multiply by 1 and then everything happens the same. But if we pick values bigger than 1, like, I don't know, this, it gets taller and taller and taller. So the idea is we need to find the correct height. And you might think, oh, this would be a pretty useful slider. That was a horrible sentence. This would be a pretty useful slider, and you'd be right. So we're going to make that another value to add to our collection of parameters right here. So we can call this one cone height instead of base height. I am slurring my words today. Cone height. And then we can just control it from here. And note that this only affects the general magnitude of the displacement of this part. It doesn't really do anything about this flattening. And unfortunately, we can't do something with a value node and connect it into this thing. That's not a thing. We could have done this more mathematically without RGB curves, but whatever. At least for now, you can still control this procedurally using this node. It's just not as nice as having a value node, but that's fine. So just find the correct height, whatever you think is correct. That looks pretty good. I'd say that it'd be better if this was a bit wider. So how do we control the width? Well, again, we can do it from here. So let's just have it go a bit more outward so it's getting closer to the edge. And that kind of looks like a cone. Kind of. So I guess there's still two things to do. Of course, by the way, just a little tip. If you want to get some nice, I don't know, what's it called, curvature, so it's not just base and then cone, you don't want this sharpness, what you can do is kind of draw a nice bend, so it kind of bends into it. I'm not going to do it because it's hard to get the shape right, so here you can see we have a more bendy cone than what we had before. You know, maybe we should just add a tiny, tiny bit of bend. There you go. I think that's nice and tasteful. But you can do that. What was I saying? I was saying that there's two things we need to do to complete the geometry of this cone. So again, I don't care about what it looks like in terms of color, reflectivity, specular, blah, 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 blah. Not right now. What we care about is the general form. Well, there's two issues. First of all, we don't necessarily want this plane here. So everything that's not the cone. We could either turn this into a street, which is something I hadn't considered, but that is something we could do, but I don't want to go over like procedural, like cement or whatever in this tutorial. So our other option, which is what I'm going to go for, is we're going to make it invisible. So again, if you're thinking, how do I get rid of everything except the cone? You might have thought, oh, I need to shrink this inwards towards the center. Doesn't need to be that complicated. We can just literally make it transparent. And that's the trick a lot of people use. So let's go with that first. So basically, the surface properties are defined by this BSDF. Well, let's also add in a transparent BSDF. So if we use the transparent BSDF, it's going to be transparent everywhere. Still going to have the geometry, we just can't see it. If we do this, it's going to give us this, so we somehow need to mix these together, right? So we mix them together, but we don't want it, 50% this and 50% this everywhere, where we can control the influence of each using the factor. We don't want that. In fact, what we want is 100% influence of our transparency here, and then 0 in our cone. Well, how do we, create this factor mask? Well, what if I told you that we already made it? Well, think about it. So imagine we look at this from the top. We want transparency everywhere outside of this rounded rectangle. Yes, we do want no transparency in the circle, but that's enclosed by this rounded rectangle. In other words, I'm saying this mask that we made, which kind of looks weird right now, but that's just because of the displacement. Imagine it looked better. Everything outside of this, we want it to be transparent. So why don't we just use this as the factor? And not really the multiplied version, but in fact this version that we haven't scaled. So let's use this right here as our factor, and you're going to notice it almost gets us there, but it's inverted, right? It is definitely inverted. So what we can do is we can either, drop in and invert before it even reaches the factor, but what I prefer is just switching these two inputs. Okay, so now we have something close. It's the right idea, but you can see some of our base is being cut into, and you're thinking, oh, the logic of what you said made sense. I don't know why this would happen. This is just an issue of geometry, and in fact, the more geometry you have, the more accurate. Now you can see we have some of these chunks that weren't here before. The more accurate you can get this, but really what's happening is that this mask that we made from the top view, just imagine it looked normal. Or you know what, let me just show you. This mask that we made is kind of like infinitely sharp, meaning that the boundaries just goes from 0 to 1 immediately. There's no fall off. And that means that when we displace, some vertices are going to fall here, some of them here, but no matter what, it's going to either be displaced or not. There's no gradual fall off for stuff to happen, meaning that, once I view this, it's going to look very choppy. So some of these vertices make the cut, some of them don't and fall into transparency. The only way we can fix this with what we have currently is adding more divisions, but I don't want to do this, so is there a smarter solution? There is. What if instead of using this mask from before, we use the same thing, but just a bit bigger? Just give it a bit of buffer room. We don't have a gradient, but we can do something almost as good, which is giving a bit of a margin or buffer. Well, yeah, we can do that. So let me just duplicate this and put in the same inputs. So for our texture coordinates, use this. For our rounding, use this, and for our side length, use this. So this node and this node are currently identical. But the only difference I want between, let me just get rid of this. The only difference I want between this one and this one is that this one should just be a tiny bit bigger. Well, how do we do that? Well, we do have this nice side length that will make it a bit bigger. Of course, we can't manipulate it here because that will affect both of these. It's connected to both. We can make that a bit clearer. So these are all connected to both. But if we have the side length be manipulated by a math node before it even reaches, then we've now kind of made this path and this path independent. So if we add 0, nothing happens. But if we add something like 0.01, and let me just zoom in here so you can see. If we add something like 0.01, it will become just a bit thicker, or a bit, bigger, but still have the same general shape. And now we want to use this, the modified version. So here's the small one, here's the big one. Whoops. Here's the small one, here's the big one. We want to use the big one as our factor. So let's see what that looks like. Okay, we need to include our displacement. Okay, so now you can see that we're almost there. In fact, we got a lot more of our geometry. And if you're thinking to yourself, the bigger the margin, the more room we have to play with, and therefore the more correct this is going to look. If that's what you're thinking, then you're correct. So instead of 0.01, we can make it like 0.02. And now you see we're getting just a bit more geometry. Let's try 0.03. And again, you could just add more divisions to also help this, but this is a nice solution. Okay, so I'm going to go with 0.05, and that seems to do it. Of course, the sacrifice is we do have some of this over here. Some of this boundary is, the floor, and we don't want that because, again, we just want the cone. But, this is the best you can do. And in fact, when we're viewing this in the viewport, our subdivisions aren't actually as dense or as high as they'd be during render. So even if it doesn't look that good on 0.02, right here, it might look, perfect on render. So at least for viewing, we can keep it at 0.05. But when it's time for render, we can make this margin a bit smaller, lose a bit of the floor, and still get good results. Okay, so that was a long tangent about how to get rid of the floor. We did it with transparency, kind of a clever solution. But now the other thing that's missing is the cone is kind of supposed to go inwards a bit. It's not like this solid thing at the top. It punches inward. In other words, we need to make a circle that we subtract. In terms of displacement, we subtract, so it goes inwards. Well, how do we make a circle? We already know this. We actually just did it. And some of the work is already done for us with this length node, which we should view from the top. Now, in fact, it's going to look a bit strange because of the displacement, so let's get rid of it. So, same length setup as before. Well, how do we, how do we make a circle? Well, we don't want to do this kind of like fall off type stuff with the RGB curves. We would rather just make it a nice sharp circle. And as we've talked about before with the rounding rectangles, in other words, part 1, we can use a math node, set it to, I think, less than is what we decided. And then we can control the radius. In fact, this just means what area is going to be punched into. And you better believe this deserves its own value. So let's call this punchin'. I'm punching him. Falling to the floor. He can't stand me anymore. My rap battle, more like rap galore. Okay, where are we? Punchin' is going to control the radius. Well, what do we want to do with this? Well, we want to use it to subtract before the displacement happens. Right? Because that's saying instead of displacing upwards, displace downwards. So let's see what this looks like. Okay, so here's our cone. What we're going to do is, we did our whole calculation. One of these is the base, and one of these is the cone part. Both of them are scaled. And then we are going to subtract our circle that we just made and put that in there. Okay, what does this look like? You can see that it kind of gives us the right idea. In fact, it gives us a fairly interesting shape. But if there's one problem with this, it's that the radius is too big. So if we make it like 0.1, now we're getting closer. But in fact, it needs to be smaller than, the flat area up top. So we just keep bringing it down. Something like that. So you can see what this is doing. Maybe a bit bigger, 0.06. whatever. We have a parameter for this is the point. So now we have something that punches in, but notice that this less than is kind of like a very discrete, either true or false kind of thing, meaning it's either completely black or completely white, which for the 1000th time we can't see when we have displacement. It's very harsh, which means that it's going to be in this area where it's subtracting and we're punching inwards. It's going to go all the way down so we can actually see it over here. This is like at floor level. At least it should be. We don't want it to go that low. We want to be able to kind of see it. So maybe it's only going in a couple inches instead of a foot. How do we do that? Well, we're subtracting it, but by how much? Well, by something that we scale by. So multiply, same trick over and over. So 1 gives us the same thing as before. 0 gives us no subtraction, right? So we get the flat top. Let's experiment. So 0.1 punches just a bit inwards, maybe not far enough. Let's do 0.2. I think I'm happy with that. And for those of you saying that I don't know the anatomy of a cone, I really don't know what it's supposed to look like, but at least the idea is nice. So let's say that that's fine. Now for this one, yes, we could add a value. I think we will. I don't really intend to use this because I think 0.2 is a good amount, but if we were to make our cone, let me bring this over. If we were to make our cone super tall, so what is that? That's cone height. If we were going to make this super tall, I would like the punch in to go a lot further than just 0.2 is the idea. So now let's see what controls we have. And again, I just want to emphasize that this floor thing is not that big of a deal. And in fact, I don't know why I didn't think about it. We should add a bit of a margin slider. So 0.05, connect this, call it margin. Okay. And now we have a control over this. So this should be smaller than it is on render because we have a bit more buffer room because the divisions are actually happening. What I meant before with the divisions are like denser on render. So you can see right now we want a fifth of a pixel dicing scale, so 0.2. And that's what's going to happen when we hit render. But right now it's previewing at 1.6. So it's like, what is that? That's 7 times? No, 8 times. I can't do math. This is 8 times less divided than it's going to be on render. So, it's going to be fine. What was I saying? I was saying that we can control the cone height. So how tall this thing is, and we can make some interesting cones using this. We have the rounding, which you don't want to make too big, but we can have a nice square cone. And notice that since this affects both of these, both the normal one and the one we're using for transparency, it's just going to work the way you'd expect. So we have rounding. We have mystery value that I didn't give a name. What is this? This is the punch-in strength. In other words, how deep down will that hole at the top we made go? So when it's set to 0, it's going to be a flat top, and we already talked about it. We have side length, which is just the size of the thing. So again, if you don't want to make it smaller than it's supposed to be, so smaller than the cone radius, yes, we could have made this mathematically handle itself. So even if we do a value too small, it will still give a good result. But for now, we're not going to do that. So that's side length. Base height is just how tall this cone is, which again, you need more geometry for. It's going to break. But going downwards shouldn't be a big deal. Yeah. We have our punch-in and our margin. And I think, unless I'm forgetting something, I think we've done our geometry very nicely. I think this is a good place to end. There's one more thing I want to do, but I think it might be stretching it for this tutorial. I think you've already learned enough. So let's just do a bit of cleanup, I guess. So since we have everything we kind of need exposed here, we can turn this whole mess into just kind of like a group node. Now, of course, there is the issue of that RGB curves, which you want to control, but if it's in a group node, you can't really. I'm just going to say that for now, we're happy with it. We can always play with it later. But for now, I'm just going to keep this because I think this is going to be useful in the future. But all of this, I think, yes. I think all of this we can group together. So that's Control G. And now we've cleaned it up just a bit. Now, of course, I didn't group it in a way that makes complete sense, but that's for you to take care of. I'm not going to take care of it for you. Okay, cool. I think that's the end of part 2. So there you go. Thank you guys for watching part 2 of PRO-CEDURAL. You've made it to the end, and there's still more to go, probably episode 3 and 4. I don't think we're going to make it past 4, but we'll see. Again, this is that end of episode Patreon plug. Please listen. I do have something to say. If you want to support this channel and you like the tutorials I make and you want benefits, the best way to support me, Default Cube CG Matter, is via the Patreon. There are different tiers. Some of them give you video courses, which are exclusive tutorials that you'd otherwise need to pay for on Gumroad. Some of the tiers give you Discord access, behind the scenes tutorial files, which is very relevant for this one. But regardless of all that, this is the best way to keep me floating and making tutorials consistently. Because I feel like I fill in a nice gap where not many people talk about this aspect of nodes in this case. But yeah, that's my end of show plug. Check out my Patreon if this is something you're interested in. I would greatly appreciate it. But you're also getting something for your money besides just feeling good. There you go. That's my pitch. See you guys.